Thank you, Randi. I don't know that I could say much more to that, but Vicki, think about it from your perspective. Various hats you've worn.
Yeah. So I wanted, before I put on two hats that I want to put on with you, one is my old Chiefs hat and two, sort of my current hat, I wanted first just to say thank you. I mean, I look around at all of the people in this room and I think about all of the people that have been so instrumental in the Common Standards movement, you know, from the organizations like Achieve to the Chiefs to NGA to the state to the writers. I mean, what an incredible gift we have just given to the teachers and the school children of this country. And I really believe that. And I'm so excited about what the standards raise for us as a possibility. And, you know, I was thinking back about my time as the chief in Pennsylvania. And, you know, one of the things I knew going in was that I couldn't possibly do everything, that I needed to do much what you heard from the math team this morning. I needed to really focus, and I needed to focus on the things that were going to be the highest leverage. And I was somebody that, because I'm so passionate about teaching and learning, I wanted to make sure that what I was doing at the state level really did drive straight to the classroom. And for me in Pennsylvania, that actually did mean going inside that big bulk of standards and identifying at that point what we were calling anchor standards, and then beginning to drive an assessment system around that and changes in teaching and learning and the classroom. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about what would I do if I had this incredible gift of common standards now, and how would I start to drive that? And what I'd like to do is just say to you straight out, here's the 5 or 6 things that I would be doing if I were sitting in your shoes. You can take it or leave it, and you heard from a number of people on this stage and earlier this morning, similar refrains. I'm just going to put it in a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 list. And then I want to talk to you just a little bit about what we feel at the Gates Foundation is our obligation to do in the country to help some of those things happen, most especially the kinds of tools. So if I were you, you've heard this already, one of the things I would do is get really clear about how and why these standards are different. And I wouldn't be lulled into thinking that they aren't all that different from what many of you are using today, because I think they are considerably different in terms of focus and what we're asking kids to do, and the real drive for the first time in my perspective to what it really means to be college and career ready at its core, without all of the larger extraneous stuff. And quite frankly, I'd be very leery of people right now, or groups that are sort of trying to peddle their wares and say they're already aligned to standards when the standards only came out in June. So I'd be cautious about all those people that are kind of coming to me and saying, you know what, if you just work with us, our stuff is already aligned and we can get going right now. I'd take a really careful look, because I think these standards call for a level of focus and cross-curriculum intentionality that we haven't seen before. And if they look the same to you, I think you should read them again really carefully and closely, and take the time to do that same thing with your staff. I mean, you've heard everyone here say teachers need that time to really read them, to absorb them. So do people that are working at the state level, if they're really going to understand how to use these standards as the powerful lever that they could be and to drive everything else. The second thing I would do, and you heard Lillian talk about it, you heard others talk about it this morning, is I would do everything I could in this interim space to shift the current test blueprint that you have to the degree that you can, knowing that it's always hard to shift an assessment. But we do have a lag time here between the time the consortium are going to put out new forms or next generations of summative assessments. And there's a lot you can do in a year or two to begin to signal to teachers what these standards are all about, and to begin to shift that blueprint. And you've heard some other things. And making sure that that focus in the early years in math and the informational texts like you heard in science and history and other things are part of that shift. Third, and you can pardon the expression, is I would work with lots of other people across the country, including us, I hope, to drive a Mack truck through this formative assessment thing. In this country, we've talked a lot about the need for formative, ongoing classroom assessments that really help kids understand where they are, that help teachers diagnose and adjust their practice in order to serve kids' needs better. And we have been so focused on summative assessments, we've never really gotten to that in a way that is powerful and at scale. Now is our time in this interim, in order not to lose momentum around assessment and to put another big important piece in place that teachers actually want and need, to really work together to drive the formative assessment piece home, so that as the summative comes in place, it's really bookends to that, and we get a very different picture over time of what student growth looks like. I'd also do what a lot of people have said. I think Alonso and Lillian and Randi all said this, which is I would use this time to really enroll the full spectrum of teachers by truly helping them understand and have the time to figure out the difference between these standards and what's previously required. And I would help everybody understand that they're now on the Getting Kids to College and Career Readiness team. That it's not just the ELA and math teachers, it's history and science teachers that have an obligation in this and that are part of that team. And I have ideas about the fact that art and music and other teachers ought to also be in that mix and how that can happen, but that's a discussion for a different day. But we should really help them figure out how they all play a fundamental role in moving this forward. And then I would use the elegance of the standards themselves. I mean, in the front of the math standards are these really incredible, there's this really incredible conversation about standards of practice in mathematics. And if you look at the literacy standards, the level of thinking required driving through those, I would use those to really start, as other people have said, to help teachers think about new models of curriculum and instruction and to help those things come alive, whether it's using one example in a district or whether you're pulling some common assignments, common lessons and other things that drive multiple examples home but fewer and focused. But starting to help teachers and kids, quite frankly, get a line of sight on what this looks like by going deeper in a few places and getting some real experience with how it can be and helping those come alive. And the last thing I would do is I'd use this time to really help people understand that these aren't so much new requirements as they are a springboard to real possibility in this country. Real possibility that we could share data about kids and about practice. Real possibility that we can share practice across school lines and district lines and state lines and really understand what works and yet still allow teachers the flexibility in this country. The real possibility that we can actually not become last as education in innovations in technology, but actually catapult ourselves much further faster and understand how kids and teachers learn these days, and to develop better tools of the trade. So this notion of next generation assessments and course designs and new instructional methods, I think are all important possibilities. And then one last thing, I actually said the last thing, but I would add one more, and that is also to begin to lay the fertile ground for the conversation about effectiveness and what that really means at every level in the country. The courage that the AFT and many other sites across the country are exhibiting and rethinking their teacher evaluations in this interim, but also with an eye toward changing those as new data and information and evidence comes online. So if I were sitting in a chief's shoes, you heard those in different ways all across the morning. I just wanted to reinforce and sort of drive those home, that that's the excitement I would be feeling if I were still sitting in Pennsylvania and what I'd be trying to do. But instead, I sat at the Gates Foundation. So my question is, and I'm happy to be there, so don't take that as an instead. But sitting at the Gates Foundation and having worn all of those hats over the years, from teacher to district superintendent to chief, it makes me feel incredibly obligated to all of you to help figure out what kinds of tools can we create in this country that can be exemplars of what we're all trying to strive for? And how can we, as Mike said, make those tools be high quality, but accessible, more cost effective, and flexible enough that teachers can both see the core evidence-based practice that they need to all aspire to, and have the kind of flexibility and creativity in their classroom that they also want to be part of that mix. So at the foundation, we're trying to do a couple of different things. One, you probably hear a lot about the fact that we're working on the front of how do we help determine effectiveness in this country, and how do we make sure that we create fair and respectful indicators of teacher performance and effectiveness. And we have a research project going that is helping us do that, where there are 3,700 teachers involved, because for us, this is clearly a co-development effort. And we have a number of sites around the country that you've heard about: Hillsborough, Pittsburgh, Memphis, the CMOs in LA. So you're probably more familiar with that work and what we're trying to do. What you may not be as familiar with is that our notion about the strategy that we're in now and the place that the country's in is that, yes, we want great, effective people in the classroom, but those great, effective people need the best tools that we can provide them. And they need clear and ready access to data and to those tools. So the Common Core standards we consider a gift, because then it enables us to think with you and with teachers across this country about what would next generation assessments actually look like if they were assessments, formative assessments that could be inserted into the classroom, into an existing curriculum, and really reflect what the math or the literacy standards. How might we create the opportunity for teachers to teach literacy very clearly by design across the entire curriculum? So what you saw on that screen is part of our Literacy by Design project, where we have teachers across the country coming together and actually working to design templates like that can again be inserted, where teachers can use their own content and they can tailor it to their own subject, but where the clarity around what we want kids to be able to do and evidence is really clear and powerful. So we're both engaged in helping create a set of formative assessments with the Shell Center. We have about somewhere between 20 and 40 of those right now under development that will be able to be popped into classrooms. We're in the process of developing templates like the Literacy by Design project, all of it being co-developed with teachers across the country so that they are fully engaged and strengthening it, and in many of the states actually that are in this room that are helping us pilot it. What is going to be different about that work, I think, is that you wouldn't be a Bill Gates if you weren't willing to really put that up on technology and make it totally accessible. So what we will do in a few months is actually put those things up on a user-friendly, we intend for it to be a user-friendly platform in which all of you will be able to access that work. And part of what we think that will do is not only provide immediate tools that you can start to use and exemplars of what this can look like so that others can start to design and emulate similar things, but it might also help us as a collective become stronger in our ability to demand from those that are producing everything from our curriculum and assessment tools to our innovative tools, to demand to be in the driver's seat for a change, to demand what we really need in terms of quality, cost, accessibility, and the ability to share practice. And Randi's so right when she says, in this country, the thing that we do the poorest is to go to scale on things and to use each other's practice as a springboard. And you know, the thing that frustrated me most as a chief and frustrated me even more as a district superintendent is I always felt like I was reinventing the wheel, just like I felt that way when I was in the classroom. And there's just no reason for that. We ought to be helping people take great practice and then create it, you know, make it more creative and make it their own. But they should have immediately accessible, user-friendly tools to work with. And that's the real obligation that we see. How do we put up teacher tools and student tools in a way that helps you forward your work in this interim period and helps drive our collective will around what others in the country can be doing. That is sort of, in a short nutshell, the kinds of things that we're thinking about, along with how do we create more innovative models of professional development? Ultimately, how do we create more innovative models of school, but doing that again alongside teachers and great people in the field, because we by no means think we have any or all of the answers, but we do believe that as a collective, we can figure this out and we can move this version of common standards truly deeply into the classroom in the way that prepare kids, but not only prepare kids, but actually incite inspire and invigorate teachers.
Thank you, Vicki. Thanks to everyone on the panel. I think we've had quite a few really good and deep ideas on the table. I want to do a couple of things now. First, a sort of process observation for a second. We were expecting, as you know, Secretary Duncan to join us for the next session. We expect him to arrive here at about 10:15, but we are paying very careful attention to his arrival, and we'll work to conclude this session in a time to have a relatively seamless transition to the secretary. That means we'll get off the stage. You won't go anyplace, because if you go out, right, you'll miss the important announcements he's going to make while you're out getting coffee. So you're going to stay put. We're going to move quickly, and we'll end as we get the signal to do that. So that process check. There were quite a few common themes that came up in this discussion. I just want to highlight two and ask a question about one. I think. I'm not sure about the numbers here. One thing that came through is the issue that you raised initially with me, which is what we need to do with the standards, or for teachers, or with teachers, we need to enable them to have the kind of conversations that will help them arrive at deep understandings of the standards, as opposed to telling them what the standards really mean, right? And that theme came loud and through in everybody's comments. A second thing that closely related to that is this is going to take time. You need to have the time and opportunity for teachers to interact with each other on a regular basis to really explore these issues in some depth. They're not going to do it in a day, they're not going to do it all at 4 in the morning, and they're not going to do it an entire set of standards all at once. You have to take issues in standards in depth, explore them deeply, collaboratively, and move on. Randi, you said that's going to take some investment. So one of the questions I want to ask is, particularly to Lillian and Alonso, you talked about doing this. You didn't mention anything about, well, you did a little bit about new resources from Race to the Top, but is this going to take new money? Is this reallocating the resources you already have? How do you deal with making the investment in the time that's necessary?
Well, do you want to go
No,
first?
go right ahead. I don't want to be bureaucratic. I'm going to let you.
Thank you.
We're looking for a bottom-up answer here.
You can only
when it
use
comes
the
to money.
resources that you have.
Mhm.
It's we're all losing money, except for Race to the Top funding or stimulus funding that backfills what we're losing. We have, over the past 2 years, reinvested in the schools, as in we've cut the central office by 33%, given the schools flexibility over the use of dollars within a frame of guidance. And at some level, and this is my ongoing conversation with the schools, there isn't any extra money. There is a shared responsibility on the part of the community to advocate for funding for education, and a shared responsibility to make sure that the dollars are used for the best purposes, and there are all kinds of competing purposes. So clearly, as the work changes, then the uses of the dollars have to change. And when I say that we have 10 days of systemic professional development that is shared with the schools, that is a huge systemic investment on adult learning. When we ensure, with collaboration from the AFT, we're an AFT affiliate, that there is a period of professional development in a school which is collaborative, that's a huge investment on the part of the district, and a concession and a part of the collaboration with the union. So the resources have to support the work, however the work gets defined. And here, clearly what we're talking about is a problem of adult learning. How do we support adult learning, even though so much of the conversation is framed around, what children now need to know and be able to do. And that means that the work has to be reoriented in order to ensure, and I'm going to go back to this, I have 6,000 teachers. They're all at some level at different points of entry in this conversation, and the obligation of the district is to be able to support every single one of them. The district cannot do it on its own, and it definitely cannot do it if it conceives of the work as something that the district will do, because the aggregation of the capacity of all should be far greater than what a central office should do. So part of the way in which we are defining the work is about making sure that the team involves everybody, and that it sort of develops in a way that makes our role stronger, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't be responsible for the kind of scaffoldings, the kind of tools, the kinds of times where we simplify, and then times when we intentionally ask for not confusion but complexity. So it's a very, very interesting work that is really no different than the work of teaching children, in that, you know, if there's a class with 25 kids, we should be assuming that there might be 3 different approaches that we need to take to make sure that every single child progresses from their point of entry. And the danger in this conversation is that we revert back to a kind of narrowing and simplification that ignores the fact that, and I go back to this question of fidelity of implementation, ignores the fact that schools are not passive. It's not necessarily about implementation, it's about invention. And there's no such thing as a school receiving a set of tools and implementing. It is always going to change almost chemically and alchemically, when it's done right, in the process of a community thinking through a challenge or practice. The other thing that I'm going to add, because it's been missing entirely in this conversation, is that parents and communities are part of this conversation, especially in communities that have challenges around supporting the schools. And a lot of the work that we're doing as well is about how do we make sure that we're not engaging in an ivory tower or even a technical exercise that is ignoring how the community and parents are experiencing what is going on at the school level around a change in terms of what their children are supposed to know and be able to do. If we're not somehow bringing them into this conversation, then we're going to have to be making adjustments in midstream that are going to be quite problematic, and not be able to tap into that aggregate capacity that I think we're trying to somehow, you know, it's a question of leveraging, of, you know, a lifting effect. Yeah.
I want to pick up on one of your comments, Alonso, and there's one last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. But all of you were nodding when Alonso was saying this is about invention. It's not about sort of top-down implementation. Right. So I think you were nodding up and down. Vicki looks like she might want to nod in a different direction.
I want to draw a distinction.
Right, because it's both.
Yeah.
It's not an either or.
Yeah, and I
Sorry.
didn't say it was. Yeah.
So in the process of reacting, right, and correcting by statement, could you talk about where, in this complex system, where is the leverage that derives from having common standards, right? In this kind of complex activity that needs to go on the ground, what is it about the nature of the fact that there are common standards that we can draw upon to make any of that work easier than it would otherwise be? Not simpler, right? But how do we take advantage of the fact that the same work will be going on in a number of places?
Well, there's more
I'll
economies of
just give a
scale.
brief example and stop. With our new assessment, our vendor is also using the same kinds of adaptive growth assessment and, of course, assessment with 2 other states. We already have MOUs with them that allow us to share items, which cuts down on costs immediately. Now imagine that 37 states in the District of Columbia, where we are using the resources nationally to align the standards, using some of the same materials and tools, because effective is effective, and especially if we have the common standards. But it also speaks to assessment costs and sharing as well. Those would be immediate saves.
Vicki?
So now I'm going to disclose that I'm a closet science fiction fan, but there's actually a historian and a science fiction writer named Isaac Asimov, who many of you might know, and there's a quote that I stumbled across years ago that I love and I always think about, so I want to give you two analogies. So one is, his quote says, "It's often better to imitate and overtake than to originate." And that's part of the distinction I want to draw, that this is about understanding fundamentally as a profession what we should be holding at core, and holding those standards and the practices that we know work as a sacred part of this profession. And then being able to innovate and customize and do all of those things. But when we do what we do a lot in this country, which is decide we are so local that we can't possibly be the same as anybody else, and we constantly set teachers there to reinvent totally, rather than letting them take what is good practice and then push it to the next place, we do them an intellectual and otherwise disservice, and we do our kids. So the second analogy I always use, I'm going to use Randy's Nike one in a different way. Nike never ever forgets its core business. They know that the fundamental bottom of that tennis shoe was what they drive everything else around, and yet they are considered one of the most innovative companies in the world. The guy who invented the Jarvik's heart knew exactly how the system worked first and then was able to innovate on top of it. Exactly. That's the distinction I would draw. That we have to be putting things, tools, in front of teachers that they can then take, customize, make their own, drive their understanding deeper. But to ask them, given the time and the resources and all that they have, to constantly be reinventing curriculum and other things, I just don't think that's what they want to do. And I think it's not using their intelligence to the best degree, or their passion to the best degree.
Thank you. Randy?
A respectful bit of a difference.
And look, I agree with Vicki in that we've gone basically to the two extremes. We do standardization with a script, where we say, this is what you do every single moment. And frankly, test prep and a script like that, if you think about teachers, it would be the easiest thing for them to do. But they complain about it all the time because they want to innovate, customize, and differentiate instruction for the needs of children. So, or alternatively, we do 1,000 flowers blooming. Both alternatives are wrong. And so what we can learn from, because at the end, let me just throw one other piece out. And we have to get over ourselves. We have to, was that pedagogical or not? We have to get over ourselves. We have to
I understood that.
fly the plane and build it at the same time. Because we deal with children in schools that, as Alonso said, are dynamic. And something's going to happen in a day that we're going to have to respond to. And that will become first and foremost. And so this is part of why teachers often say, have you been in a school lately? But ultimately, what we don't do in education, what virtually every major business does, and what they have done in the medical profession so much better than we ever have, which is they have figured out what is core and then what can we customize and innovate from. And so we need that balance. But what I'm actually driving at is that even after you get that, teachers do part of the learning that we do for children, but part of adult learning as well, is that the way you own things is to feel it, touch it, see it, work with it, and have the freedom and the confidence to take that risk. And so I don't know who said it, but at one point or another, we have to maintain the urgency of moving forward with the confidence and the trust and the flexibility of being able to take that risk, because some things will fail. And the worst thing we can do is when we think that people are pretty good at what they do, we can't make every single moment in their lives so high stake that they become immobile as opposed to take the risk to succeed. And I don't, and so that's part of why this work on curriculum is so important. But what Vicki said, if I understood her right, using this period of time in some ways, not to ignore the current assessment and accountability standards, but to actually say, look, we need to focus more on how we create these than how we deal with fidelity with the old dumbed down test would be the way I would try to move.
Thank you. Lillian?
One way to talk to Randy's point about taking risks is, and many districts and states are already doing a lot of it, is embedded professional development, where they're actually working with teacher leaders who are colleagues or data coaches, instructional coaches who are in the classroom with them, observing their practice, giving them feedback. Is not to Randy's point about taking risks, is, and many districts and states are already doing a lot of it, is embedded professional development, where they're actually working with teacher leaders who are colleagues or data coaches, instructional coaches who are in the classroom with them, observing their practice, giving them feedback. Is not evaluative, is supervisory, and is instructive. And they learn much more. We don't pull on their time because it's done in time with the students. And I think the students seeing the teachers engage in that kind of growth and learning and professional development also allows them to take more risks.
Career ladders too, negotiating career ladders.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm guessing there's probably one or two comments or thoughts or issues that people want to raise. So this is now, we have mic runners. This is now time for the audience to participate. Let's start with Linda.
Thank you. Randy Weingarten, you very articulately and I think very accurately described the public frustration with public education. And the message that you gave I thought was very constructive about engaging teachers. It contrasts, however, with the knee-jerk defense of the status quo that we hear from many local and state affiliates. And I'm wondering if you can tell us, what are you doing to convey to those levels the importance of acknowledging the urgency and bringing their expertise to the table instead of simply giving a resistant message?
So tell me what state you're from.
I'm from Massachusetts, and I love Tom Gosnell.
Okay, so let me just say this. I'm the head of the AFT. I am not the head of the NEA. And I'm not being disparaging in any way. Stop. That wasn't an applause line. But, so I can tell you what we're doing. And, this is, I understand the frustration. I do. I understand everybody's frustration. But we have to actually try to move through it. So, one of the reasons that I say see, touch, feel, and why in some ways, even though I tease about pilots, why it's important is that with familiarity about what is successful and what breeds success comes both confidence in using it and comes scalability and then a tipping point. And so if you think about the process of change that way, then you do the kinds of things that we are trying to do. So number one, in our union, the comprehensive evaluation frameworks that we proposed in January, and lots of people thought that my members would be concerned about our proposal that included student learning as a piece of evaluation. I don't talk about it as student achievement tests, I talk about it as student learning, that there would be some deep consternation amongst our locals. So we've done our work. I won't tell you how much I'm on the road, but it's about once or twice a week. We've done our work. And in July, I was incredibly proud of my convention and my members. They overwhelmingly adopted that as national AFT policy. And we have somewhere between 50 and 60 locals that are working with their districts to engage in this work.
We're one. Yeah.
They're one.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that I have a magic wand that's going to sprinkle magic dust throughout the world. But teachers and local leaders, when they see, feel, touch things, and see success, and see this kind of mutual respect, that's the work we do, the mutual respect that you hear up here. And that's what we're trying to drive at, to try to create that tipping point. Having said that, it takes two to tango. And so when teachers constantly, and unions constantly get this diatribe of scapegoating and demonization, the first thing we're going to do is try to fight back, because what it is a disrespect about who we are. And so you see that a lot. The last thing I'll say is this. There's lots and lots of places where there is an absence of collective bargaining. And frankly, in those places, things are, in my judgment, a lot worse. I actually have watched how contracts can be solution-driven and a huge help in terms of systemic reform. And we have to just create the conditions to do that. So that's what we're trying to do. Is it perfect? No. But have we done a lot in the last 2 years? I suspect that my partners here and throughout the country would say that we have. But through respect, collaboration, and persuasion about both the urgency and then the tools to do things right.
Thank you. We're going to have time for, it looks like, one or two more questions before we need to transition. Is there a question back there?
Hi, Diana Circo, Deputy Commissioner in Colorado. And just coming to this in my third month after leaving a superintendency and then having been a principal, et cetera. My question is, as we know, and you have great examples of the kind of hand-holding and support that we've got to do in order to really help the Common Core become a reality in our classrooms. I guess my question is, we know that true knowledge and understanding has to precede any kind of real implementation. How do we inspire teachers, principals, superintendents to be a student of the game and really know and understand the Common Core to help us with the implementation?
I believe the conditions we put around the work, and many folks this morning have talked about that, will impact that beneficially. We've talked about the need to make sure, to Alonso's point, that we unpack things in a way with people at the table that they understand and help in the evolution of it and not be handed something and say do it. I think we unpack it in a way and knowing that they're going, making sure they understand that they're going to have tools, that we're not just going to force this on them and kind of walk away and leave it to them to figure out, but we're going to make sure that they have the appropriate tools to get the work done. And collaboration can't be a buzzword. We talk about that, we talk about that. Collaboration has to be real. And in Delaware, during our work, our teachers and their unions have been at the table with us since day one, and they're still there. Do we agree on everything? Absolutely not. But if we don't get them engaged in a way where we can agree to disagree, it's going to retard the process in a way that's not going to be beneficial for anyone. So I think constant open communication, knowing that we're going to have resources at their disposal as we phase it in, and that we're going to be deliberate about how we do that, will certainly get people more comfortable with the process.
So I think a really strong message you're hearing from everyone here, and you heard from the panel before us, is that people have to get into it. I mean, you know, in my own experience in the district, and again as a chief, I couldn't change people's beliefs by just standing up and being passionate about something, even though I can be really passionate. People had to experience it to change their belief system. And I think what you're hearing from everybody is let people get their hands on this and have those conversations. And it's going to be messy and time-consuming in some ways and all of that. But that's how you get the kind of longer-term buy-in. And using some of the basic tools to then help teachers see what the potential in their classroom with kids. I mean, that's when teachers get really driven behind this stuff.
And say to them, make sure you say to them, we know you cannot do this alone. Teachers often feel like every bit of the responsibility for every bit of students' education is on their shoulders, and they take it deeply, and it sometimes really frightens them. You have to find ways to make sure that there really is shared responsibility, and that they know you feel that. Again, that it's not a buzzword, but that they know that you feel that.
I will say three things. The intellectual nature of this exercise, and the standards are an intellectual tour de force, I think, will drive certain things, because many people want to be challenged. And many people are true professionals and are not often treated as professionals. So there's that aspect of the work. Secondly, unfortunately, in the context of this conversation, the assessments are going to drive a lot of the adjustments in the long run, which is why it's so important to get them right. The schools adjust to what is measured. And I guarantee you that people who do not embrace this work at the beginning will embrace it at the end when the assessments come in, which is, and they will be losers in the process, which is part of the reason why we're investing so much in embracing it now. The third aspect also, unfortunately, is that it's, we are all dependent on some way in a local context, which it's either pro-improvement, pro-reform, however that gets defined, or local contexts which are about stagnation. So what happens on the ground in individual schools and individual districts matters tremendously. And there's so much churn on the ground at every level, teachers, principals, superintendents, that one of the great things about this is that they're potentially a real common thread that is going to link us all in some way. So again, I go back to what I said at the beginning. I'm incredibly hopeful about this.
Can I go back and link this to the dollar conversation earlier too about resources? I mean, the simple way I think about this sometimes is that if you have such tight budget dollars, then you have to use what's in the system, right, to move your levers. And in any school district's budget, most often 85 to 95% is in human beings, and the majority of that is in teachers. So if you want change in student performance, where do you have to put your emphasis on how to get people to be more productive against that change? In those teachers. And that's the way to move the needle. So they have to become such a focal point of this in both terms of understanding and being given the right tools and being able to engage in the conversations and get some experience with this in a way, like you guys have all said, that's pretty safe.
Well, we've had a great conversation. I think this could go on for hours, if not days, and some of it will go on later today as we continue the thread of discussion in this meeting about the implementation of the Common Core. Alonso started his last comment by talking about assessments really mattering. Momentarily, the secretary will be here and we'll have a word or two to say about assessments. So I think this is a great point to pivot. So please join me in thanking the panel.